One ordinary night in a quiet diner. A frightened boy hides under a table, but what his billionaire father witnesses next will change their lives forever. The evening was supposed to be just another part of his routine. For most people, going out to eat was a special occasion, but for Richard Dalton, one of the richest businessmen in the city, it was only a small break in his tightly scheduled day. He was the kind of man everyone recognized in newspapers and magazines, the face of success, the symbol of wealth, and the person people admired, but also whispered about from a distance. His world was built on glass towers, luxury cars, exclusive clubs, and expensive suits. Yet behind all of that, there was a man who had become more of a machine than a father. Someone who had learned how to build empires but not how to build simple moments of happiness with his only child. That child, 2-year-old Daniel, sat quietly. Beside him, in the back seat of their sleek black car, the boy's small hands clutched the toy robot he carried everywhere. A robot that had scratches and faded colors because it was played with endlessly. Richard had tried many times to replace it with newer, shinier ones, but Daniel always shook his head. He didn't care for new toys. He wanted the one that had been with him since his mother had given it to him before she passed away. Richard noticed it, but never really understood. In his world, things were always replaced. A car, a phone, even a house. Everything could be upgraded. But for his son, that scratched toy was irreplaceable. The chauffeur parked in front of a restaurant. That was not the kind of place Richard usually visited. It was not one of the glamorous 5-star restaurants where he often dined with partners or clients. Instead, this was a family-style diner his assistant had chosen, believing it might be more suitable for the boy. Richard had agreed reluctantly, thinking perhaps a quieter place would help him connect with his son, though deep inside he didn't know how to start that connection. As they walked inside, Daniel clutched his toy tightly and looked around with wide eyes. The diner was warm and welcoming, filled with the smell of fresh bread, sizzling food, and laughter from families sitting close together. To Daniel, it felt alive. It's different from the grand but cold restaurants where he often felt like an invisible guest in his father's shadow. To Richard, it felt almost too ordinary, almost out of place for a man of his position. But he stayed silent. They were shown to a booth near the window, and that was when she appeared. The waitress. Her name was Emily, though Richard didn't know it yet. She wore a simple uniform, her hair tied back neatly, but her eyes carried a warmth that instantly drew Daniel's attention. She approached the table with a friendly smile, holding a notepad, and spoke in a voice that sounded more like kindness than formality. "Hi there," she said, looking at Daniel first instead of his father. "And who's this little guy? It's Daniel?" Looked down shyly, mumbling his name, but his lips curved in the faintest smile. He wasn't used to strangers paying attention to him. Usually people spoke only to his father, never to him. Emily noticed his robot toy and leaned closer. "That's a cool robot you've got there. Does he have a name?" For the first time that evening, Daniel's face lit up a little. "Rusty," he said softly. "Rusty," he repeated with interest, as if it was the most important name in the world. "I like that. I bet Rusty has been on a lot of adventures with you." The boy nodded, and something flickered in Richard's eyes. It was a strange mix of surprise and discomfort. His son was talking freely to a stranger, saying more in that moment than he usually said during their long dinners together. Richard cleared his throat, feeling the urge to re-establish control of the conversation. He ordered food quickly, almost mechanically, without looking at the menu. His voice was sharp, efficient, the way he spoke to his staff. Emily scribbled down the order politely, but she kept glancing at Daniel, who was clearly more comfortable with her than with his own father. As the evening unfolded, Richard watched quietly while Emily returned to their table again and again. Each time, she found a way to make Daniel laugh, or at least smile. But what games he liked, about what games he liked, about Rusty's superpowers. Daniel answered shyly at first, but slowly. His words grew more confident, his laughter brighter. Richard listened, but didn't know how to join in. It was as if there was a language between them that he couldn't speak, a language of warmth and attention that money could not buy. Richard's mind wandered as he observed them. Thought of his own childhood, raised by a father who valued discipline and achievement over affection. He had grown up in a large house that always felt empty, filled with silence instead of laughter. His father had been wealthy too, but cold, expecting perfection from his son. Now, looking at Daniel smiling at this waitress, Richard wondered, if he had unknowingly become a mirror of his own father. Emily returned with their food. Balancing the plates with ease, her movements quick but graceful, she set Daniel's plate in front of him with care, saying, "Here you go, buddy. I made sure they put extra fries on the side." Daniel's eyes widened with delight. It was such a small gesture, but to him it felt special. He looked up at her as if she had given him a treasure. Richard couldn't help but notice. He had never thought about whether his son liked extra fries or not. He simply instructed his staff at home to prepare healthy meals. But in that simple moment, he realized how little he knew about the small things that made his son happy. As the dinner went on, Richard's phone buzzed repeatedly. His instinct was to answer every call, to check every message, because that was his world. Deals didn't wait. But each time he reached for his phone, Daniel's shoulders sank a little lower, and Emily's eyes flicked toward him with something that almost looked like disappointment. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt a sting of shame. He silenced the phone and left it on the table, unused. The meal ended, but the feeling of change lingered in the air. Richard watched his son giggling at something Emily said. Watched the boy's face glowing with a happiness he rarely saw at home. For the first time, Richard felt like an outsider in his own family, like he was watching his son open up to a stranger in a way he had never managed. He paid the bill. With a large tip, the kind of tip that made other waitresses gasp in gratitude, but Emily only smiled politely. She thanked him, of course, but the real smile, the genuine one, was reserved for Daniel, who waved shyly as they left the diner. Richard noticed that too. Money impressed everyone else, but it didn't seem to matter much to her. What mattered was the boy. Back in the car, as the city lights blurred past the windows, Richard leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. His son was holding Rusty again, whispering something to the toy, perhaps replaying the evening in his own little world. Richard felt a strange heaviness in his chest, a mixture of guilt and realization. He had walked into that diner thinking it was just another night, but something had shifted. A waitress, someone he wouldn't have even noticed before, had shown him a side of his son he barely knew existed. He didn't know then that this was only the beginning. That simple dinner, that quiet smile under the warm light of an ordinary diner, would soon become the first step toward a series of events that would change not just his son's life, but his own. The restaurant was alive with the quiet hum of conversations and the clinking of cutlery against plates. For a while, Richard sat back in the booth, watching his son nibble happily on fries while the waitress, Emily, floated from one table to another, balancing trays and offering smiles as if it were second nature to her. Richard still found himself oddly unsettled. He wasn't used to being invisible. Normally, when he entered a place, the room shifted to accommodate him, to impress him, to remind him of who he was. But tonight, no one was asking for his opinion on business. No one was praising his achievements. Instead, all the warmth in the room seemed to orbit around his son and the waitress, just as he was adjusting to this unusual dynamic. The sound of the diner's door being shoved open cut through the cozy atmosphere. It wasn't the polite chime of a bell or the ordinary noise of late-night customers. It was forceful, loud, and carried with it an energy that immediately turned heads. 3 men walked in, their movements heavy, their expressions sharp. They weren't dressed like casual diners. They looked rough, restless, and out of place in the cheerful little diner. At first, Richard thought nothing of it. He was used to men walking into places with the kind of authority that commanded attention. He himself often did the same. Within seconds, he realized this was different. These weren't businessmen. Their eyes darted around the room, scanning people, calculating. One of them pulled a hood over his head. Another shoved his hands deep into his jacket pocket as if holding something inside. The third walked straight toward the counter with an expression that sent a chill through the air. A tense silence spread. Through the diner, conversations halted mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to mouths, and all that remained was the heavy sound of boots against the tiled floor. Richard's body stiffened instinctively. He had faced boardroom battles, hostile takeovers, and cutthroat rivals. But this was chaos, something unpredictable, something outside his control. Daniel felt it too. The boy's small hand clutched Rusty the robot tightly, his eyes wide as he looked up at his father. For a split second, Richard's instinct was to shield him, but his body betrayed him. He froze, staring, calculating like he would in a business negotiation, but unable to move. His mind searched for logic. Were they robbers, drunk troublemakers, or simply men looking for a fight? But in that hesitation, the world around him shifted faster than he could comprehend. Emily, who had been carrying a tray of drinks to another table, noticed the same danger. Unlike Richard, she didn't pause to analyze or hesitate. Her eyes flicked toward Daniel, who was sitting exposed on the outside of the booth, small and vulnerable. She didn't think about who his father was, didn't think about the tip she had just received, didn't think about anything except the instinct that gripped her heart like fire. Without a second's hesitation, she set the tray down and crouched beside the boy. "Come here, sweetheart," she whispered quickly, her voice calm but firm. Daniel looked at her, confused, but when he saw the seriousness in her eyes, he obeyed. She gently tugged him down, guiding him under the table, into the shadowed safety beneath it. She crawled in beside him, wrapping one arm protectively around his shoulders. Richard blinked in shock, watching this unfold right in front of him. A waitress, a stranger, was crouched under the table with his son, shielding him with her body as if he were her own child. For a moment, Richard felt a sting in his chest, something between awe and shame. Why hadn't he thought of that? Why hadn't he moved first? He was the father, yet it was her who had acted. Above them, the situation escalated. One of the men at the counter slammed his fist against the register, barking orders at the cashier. The cook in the kitchen froze, hands trembling as he looked toward the commotion. Customers huddled close together, whispering in fear, some daring to pull out phones under the table. The air was thick with panic, but under the booth, Emily was whispering softly to Daniel. "It's okay," she murmured. "We're safe down. Here, you're safe with me." Daniel's little body trembled against her, but the sound of her voice, steady, gentle, soothed him more than the luxury of any mansion ever could. He clutched Rusty tighter, pressing the robot to his chest, and buried his face against her shoulder. Emily stroked his hair with her free hand, shielding him from the frightening sounds above. Richard sat frozen for a moment longer, torn between rising to confront the situation and crouching down to join them. But when he looked at his son, his fragile boy, tucked into the arms of a stranger, his heart twisted. He bent down awkwardly, sliding into the small space under the table. His expensive suit brushed against the sticky floor, but for once, he didn't care. Daniel's eyes flicked toward his father, but instead of clinging to him, he nestled closer against Emily. That small gesture pierced Richard more deeply than any weapon could. His son felt safer with her than with him. Richard wanted to protest, to pull him back into his own arms, but something stopped him. Instead, he stayed there, crouched awkwardly, watching as Emily whispered reassurance in a way he never knew how. Outside their little hiding place, the men's voices grew louder, demanding cash, shouting at terrified staff. The world above the table was chaos, shoes stomping, dishes breaking, people crying, but beneath it, there was a strange bubble of quiet. Emily's calm tone, Daniel's slow breaths, the sound of Rusty clinking faintly as the boy held him, all of it seemed to create a shield around them. Minutes felt like hours. Richard's body ached from crouching in such a cramped space, but he didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on his son's face, watching every flicker of fear and every sigh of relief as Emily whispered to him. He felt useless, powerless, like a man stripped of everything that made him who he was. His wealth, his power, his influence, none of it mattered here. None of it could protect his child. Only this ordinary waitress, with no riches to her name, seemed to know exactly what to do. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, The shouts began to fade. The men grabbed money from the register and stormed out, the sound of the diner's door slamming shut echoing like thunder. Slowly, the room filled again with the sound of shaky breaths and people emerging from hiding places. Some were already dialing the police, others comforting children who had burst into tears. Under the table, Emily waited a few extra moments, making sure it was safe before gently pulling Daniel out. She held his small hand tightly in hers, guiding him back to the seat. The boy clung to her, his knuckles white against her sleeve. Richard crawled out more stiffly, brushing at his suit jacket. But his movements were slower than usual, his mind still trapped in the storm of what had just happened. He looked at his son, at the way Daniel leaned against Emily. And for the first time in his life, Richard felt completely humbled. "Are you okay?" Emily asked the boy softly, kneeling down. So her face was level with his. Daniel nodded, his lips trembling, but his eyes steady. "You were very brave," she told him, her smile gentle. "Rusty must be proud of you." The boy's lips curled into a faint smile despite the fear still clinging to him. He looked at his robot and whispered, "Rusty kept me safe." Richard's throat tightened. It wasn't Rusty, it wasn't him, it was her. This woman, this waitress, had been the shield his son needed. And Richard, for all his billions, had been nothing more than a bystander. He wanted to thank her, but the words stuck in his throat. Gratitude was not something he was used to expressing. He was used to commanding, rewarding with money, solving problems by writing checks. But how could money ever repay what she had just given him? As the sirens wailed in the distance and the police finally arrived, Richard remained quiet, watching Emily with his son. She wasn't frightened for herself. She wasn't asking for praise. Her only concern was the boy. In that moment, Richard realized with painful clarity that everything he thought made and powerful was meaningless compared to the courage of this woman who had nothing but her heart to give. And as he sat there in that ordinary diner, surrounded by overturned chairs and frightened faces, he knew deep inside that this moment would not leave him. Something had shifted, something irreversible. The image of his son hiding under the table with Emily's arms around him was burned into his memory, and it would haunt him until he understood what it truly meant. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cars filled the street outside the diner, casting uneasy colors across the faces of everyone inside. Officers moved quickly, taking statements, calming frightened customers, and collecting details about the men who had caused the chaos. People were still shaken, whispering nervously about what had happened, but slowly. The tension began to ease. Richard sat in the booth, his expensive jacket crumpled from crouching under the table, his tie slightly loose, his face unusually pale. He wasn't used to fear. His whole life had been about control, about having the upper hand, about knowing exactly what to do in every situation. But tonight had stripped him of all of that. He had been helpless, and that helplessness was something he could not shake off easily. Beside him, Daniel was still pressed close to Emily. The boy hadn't let go of her hand since the moment she pulled him out from under the table. He clung to her as though she were his anchor in a storm. Richard watched silently, unable to interrupt, unable to understand how quickly his son had attached himself to this woman. They had met less than an hour ago. Emily crouched down to speak to Daniel at his level again. Her voice was soft, careful, as though she was trying not to disturb the fragile calm that had settled over him. "Hey, buddy," she said with a gentle smile. "It's all over now. You did so well. You were really brave in there." Daniel looked at her with wide eyes, his small face still pale, but steadier than before. He whispered, "I was scared." Molly squeezed his hand lightly. "Of course you were. Everyone was scared. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep going even when you are." The boy nodded slowly, taking in her words as though they were the most important lesson he had ever heard. Richard felt a strange tightness in his chest, listening to this exchange. He realized, with a heavy pang, that he had never spoken to his son this way. He had always believed children needed to be strong, to be tough, to grow up quickly in a world that showed no mercy. But watching Daniel with Emily, he realized strength didn't always come from hardness. Sometimes it came from gentleness, The officers finished speaking to the staff and the customers, and slowly the diner began to return to some form of order. Broken dishes were swept up, chairs were set back in place, and people began to leave, murmuring about what they had witnessed. Richard, however, remained seated, still unable to move from the weight of what had just happened. Daniel tugged at Emily's sleeve. "Can you sit with us?" he asked quietly, almost shyly, as if afraid she might say no. Emily glanced at Richard, unsure of whether the request would be welcomed. But to her surprise, the powerful billionaire, who usually commanded every room, simply nodded. He gestured to the booth. "Please," he said, his voice lower than usual, almost humbled. Emily slid into the booth beside Daniel, who leaned against her as if he had known her forever. Richard watched them, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite put into words. He had spent years trying to connect with his son through expensive gifts, through strict routines, through making sure he had the best schools and the best clothes. Yet here was a woman who had given Daniel nothing but kindness. And already the boy was opening up to her in a way Richard had never seen. The waitress asked Daniel about Rusty again, about how long he had been with him and what adventures they had gone on together. Daniel's voice grew a little stronger with each answer. He told her about the time he pretended Rusty flew around the backyard, about the times he had built forts out of pillows and declared Rusty the hero of his tiny kingdom. Emily listened with genuine interest, nodding and laughing at the right moments, never once rushing him. Richard sat quietly, torn between admiration and guilt. He realized he had never heard these stories himself. He had been too busy, too distracted, too caught up in his empire to notice the world his son had created inside his small, fragile heart. He felt like a stranger sitting across from his own child. After a while, Daniel grew tired. The night's fear had drained him, and his eyelids began to droop. He leaned his head against Emily's arm, clutching Rusty tightly. Emily looked down at him with a tenderness Richard hadn't seen in years. She smoothed his hair away from his forehead and whispered something softly that made the boy smile, even in his half-sleep. Richard finally spoke, his voice breaking the quiet. "Thank you," he said, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. He wasn't a man who said thank you often. He was used to paying people for their time, rewarding them with bonuses, not expressing gratitude. But tonight, nothing else seemed enough. You saved him." Emily shook her head, her eyes still on Daniel. "I didn't save him. I just did what anyone would do. He's just a child. He needed someone in that moment," Richard studied her face, trying to understand her. To him, people always had motives. They wanted something: money, power, connections. Yet she sat there, holding his son, with no expectation in her eyes. She wasn't doing this for a reward. She was doing it because it was who she was. For the rest of the evening, Emily stayed near, even after her shift had technically ended. She helped Daniel finish the last of his fries when he woke up again, turning the scary night into something softer. Something that felt almost like a memory of comfort rather than fear. Richard watched, speaking little, but inside, something was stirring. The car ride home was different that night. Usually Daniel sat silently beside him, staring out the window or playing with Rusty, while Richard focused on his phone. But tonight, Daniel was still talking, replaying the evening to Emily, who had agreed to ride with them since it was late and her apartment was on the way. He described the way they had hidden under the table, how Emily had whispered to him, how he had felt Rusty protecting him. His voice was animated, his eyes bright despite the exhaustion. Richard listened, torn between pride that his son was speaking so freely and sorrow that the words weren't directed at him. He sat in silence, staring at the boy through the reflection. In the tinted window, he knew deep down this was the beginning of something he could no longer ignore. When the car finally dropped Emily off at her small apartment building, Daniel's face fell. "Do you have to go?" he asked, his voice heavy with disappointment. Emily crouched down, meeting his eyes. "I do, sweetheart. But you're going to be okay. You're stronger than you think." "Will I see you again?" he asked hopefully. She smiled softly. "Maybe. The world's funny like that. Sometimes it brings people together again, when they're meant to meet." Daniel hugged her tightly, surprising even himself. Richard watched the embrace, a knot forming in his throat. Couldn't remember the last time his son had hugged someone so freely. When Emily finally walked away and disappeared into the building, Daniel pressed his face against the car window, watching until she was gone. Then he leaned back against the seat, holding Rusty close, and whispered, "She made me feel safe, Dad."
Ow.
Those simple words cut through Richard's heart. His son had never said that about him. The rest of the ride was silent.
Oh.
Richard sat in the darkness, the city lights flashing by, his mind heavy with realization. For years he had thought providing wealth, protection, and status was enough. But tonight, a woman with nothing but kindness had shown him what true safety and love looked like in his son's eyes. When they reached home, Daniel fell asleep quickly, still holding Rusty. Richard stood in the doorway of his son's room for a long time, watching him breathe, his small chest rising and falling. He thought of Emily, of how natural it had been for her to comfort him, how easily she had done what he himself had never managed. And for the first time in many years, he felt something he hadn't felt since he was a boy: loneliness. Not the loneliness of being without people, but the loneliness of realizing he had built walls so high around himself that even his own son couldn't climb over them. Lying awake that night, Richard knew that what had happened at the diner wasn't just a frightening incident to forget. It was a turning point. His son had found a bond with someone in mere minutes that he had never been able to create in years. And that bond, fragile yet powerful, was about to change everything he thought. He knew about being a father, about being a man, and about what truly mattered in life. The days after the diner incident seemed quieter for Richard, but inside him there was a storm he could not name. He returned to his office towers, to the endless meetings, contracts, and phone calls, but something in him was restless. His mind wandered during boardroom discussions. He stared at graphs and numbers on screens, but all he saw was the image of his son under that table, clinging to Emily, safe in her arms and not his, at home. Daniel was different too. He was quieter in some ways, thoughtful in others. But whenever he spoke of that night, his eyes brightened. Spoke of Emily as though she were a hero out of one of his stories, how someone who had appeared out of nowhere and changed everything. Richard listened, sometimes with a heavy heart, sometimes with silent envy. He had tried in his own way to step closer to his son after that night. He turned his phone off at dinners. He asked Daniel about his day, even tried to join in when Daniel was playing with Rusty, but the boy's responses were short, cautious, as though he wasn't sure how long his father's sudden interest would last. It was one Friday evening, almost 2 weeks later, when fate intervened again. Richard had taken Daniel to the park. It was a rare thing for him to do. Usually the nanny handled outings, but that day he had insisted. Perhaps he was trying to make up for something invisible, or perhaps he was searching for another chance. Daniel was running with other children, Rusty clutched in his hand, when suddenly his face lit up. "Dad, it's her," Daniel shouted, pointing. Richard followed his gaze and saw her. Emily. She was sitting on a bench, a paper bag of groceries beside her hair a little messy from the wind, her clothes simple and worn. Beside her was a little girl, no older than 5, laughing as she fed crumbs to pigeons. Daniel ran to her before Richard could react. Emily looked up, surprised, and then broke into a smile as Daniel threw his arms around her. The little girl giggled at the sight, curious about the boy who seemed so excited. Richard walked up more slowly, his heart beating faster than he expected. He was a man who faced financial crises with calm, who could negotiate with billionaires without breaking a sweat. But here, approaching a waitress on a park bench, he felt strangely unsure. "Hello again," Emily said, her tone warm but casual, as though they were simply old acquaintances meeting by chance. Richard nodded. "Hello. It seems Daniel has a better memory than I do. He's got a strong heart," Emily said, looking at the boy who was already talking to her daughter. "And a good friend in Rusty." The children laughed together, the sound pure and unfiltered. Richard watched, something softening inside him. He realized then that Emily wasn't just a waitress. She was a mother. "This is Lily," Emily introduced. gesturing to her little girl. "She's my world." Richard nodded politely, but inside something stirred. The way Emily looked at Lily, the pride, the love, the devotion, it was so natural, so full. He envied it. Envied how easy it seemed for her to give her child everything she needed without luxury, without wealth. They sat for a while watching. "The children play." Richard awkwardly at first asked questions about Lily, about how Emily managed work and motherhood. She answered honestly, without shame, speaking of long shifts, of juggling bills, of sleepless nights. Her life was hard, yet she spoke of it without bitterness. Richard listened, and with each word he felt the contrast more sharply. His own life was filled with abundance, yet empty of meaning. Hers was filled with struggle, yet rich with love. When Daniel and Lily returned, Emily opened her grocery bag and pulled out 2 sandwiches. She handed one to Lily, then noticed Daniel's curious eyes. Without hesitation, she tore her sandwich in half and gave it to him. "Oh, here you go," she said. Daniel accepted it gratefully, munching happily. Richard frowned slightly. His instinct was to protest, to say his son didn't need to eat half a sandwich when he could buy the whole bakery if he wanted. But he stayed silent, watching the small moment. The boy's joy was not in the food itself, but in sharing it with Lily. Later, when Emily gathered her groceries, Richard offered, "I'll have my driver take you home. It's safer." She shook her head firmly. "Thank you, but we're fine. The bus works just as well." Richard was taken aback. People never refused his offers. Most saw him as a golden ticket. But Emily was different. She didn't want his charity. She wanted her independence, her dignity. Still, that night, Daniel wouldn't stop talking about Lily and Emily. He begged his father to let him see them again. Richard, curious himself, found excuses to visit the diner more often. Each time, Daniel lit up when he saw Emily, and each time, Richard saw something new. He saw how she worked tirelessly, never complaining, smiling, even when her feet must have ached. He saw how she treated every customer with respect, no matter who they were. And most of all, he saw how Daniel flourished in her presence at first. Richard thought of helping her in the only way he knew financially. One evening, after a meal, he tried slipping an envelope of money under the receipt, more than enough to cover months of her rent. But Emily spotted it and slid it back to him firmly. "I appreciate the thought," she said softly, "but I don't want to be bought. I work for what I have. That's the only way I know to teach my daughter what matters." Richard felt a sting, but it wasn't anger. It was respect. She was teaching him something no boardroom ever had, the value of dignity, of humility, of small joys. Slowly, the two worlds began to intertwine. Emily invited Daniel and Richard to join her and Lily at the park more often. Sometimes they went for ice cream, sometimes just for walks. Daniel and Lily became inseparable, their laughter filling the air like music. Richard, at first a silent observer, began to learn how to step into that laughter, how to share it instead of standing on the outside. One Sunday afternoon, Emily invited them to her apartment for dinner. It was a modest space, small and worn, but filled with warmth. The walls had drawings Lily had made, the shelves had books and little trinkets collected over the years, and the table was set simply, but with care. Richard sat there, uncomfortable at first, unused to such simplicity. But then something unexpected happened. He laughed. It was a small laugh at first when Lily spilled juice and Emily joked about it. Then another when Daniel and Lily fought, playfully over a piece of bread. Then another when Emily teased him for not knowing how to pass the salt without knocking over the pepper. By the end of the evening, he realized he hadn't laughed like that in years. The billionaire's world and the waitress's world were clashing. Yes, but they were also blending. She showed him that happiness didn't need marble floors or chandeliers. It could be found in small apartments filled with drawings, in shared sandwiches, in the sound of children's laughter. And Richard began to change. He spent less time at the office, more time with his son. He learned to cook simple meals, even if he burned the first few attempts. He started noticing things he had ignored before: the way the evening sky turned pink, the way Daniel's eyes lit up when he talked about Rusty. The way Lily clapped her hands when she was excited, Emily didn't let him take the easy path of throwing money at problems. She made him listen, learn, slow down. And though at first it was uncomfortable, even painful, Richard realized he was becoming a different man. For years he had believed his wealth set him apart, made him superior. But Emily's quiet strength, her refusal to be bought, her lessons. In humility, they brought him back down to earth. She taught him that being a father wasn't about providing the best schools or the most expensive toys. It was about being present, being there when fear struck, when laughter rang out, when small joys lit up the world. And though he didn't admit it out loud, Richard knew deep down that his son wasn't the only one whose life Emily was changing. The seasons began to shift. What had started as a sudden, frightening night in a diner had quietly grown into something deeper, something none of them had expected. Weeks turned into months, and with every passing day, Richard found his world being reshaped, not by business deals or by wealth, but by simple moments that touched his heart in ways he had never known before. He had once measured success by numbers, profits, contracts, and empires. Now he found himself measuring his days in different ways, in Daniel's laughter, in the way Emily's voice softened when she comforted Lily, in the warmth of evenings spent around a small table sharing food that wasn't served by chefs, but made with care. For the first time, Richard stopped counting money and started counting moments. It wasn't easy at first. He had to unlearn the habits of a lifetime. There were nights when his phone buzzed with urgent calls, and his instinct was to answer, but then he saw Daniel looking at him, waiting, hoping, and he forced himself to turn it off. There were times when he wanted to solve every problem with his checkbook. But Emily reminded him with quiet words and steady eyes that some problems weren't meant to be solved with money. They were meant to be lived through, learned from, and grown out of. Slowly he changed, and people around him noticed. His business partners whispered that he seemed distracted, softer. His assistants saw him leave early from work to pick up his son or spend time at the park. For Richard, none of that mattered. What mattered was that his son was smiling more, laughing louder, holding his hand instead of shrinking away. Daniel blossomed in ways that surprised everyone. The shy boy who once spoke little now told stories, shared jokes, and even sang silly songs with Lily. He had found not only a friend, but also a kind of family he never knew he needed. The connection between him and Emily grew stronger, too. It trusted her, confided in her, leaned on her in ways he never had with anyone else. Richard watched it all, grateful yet quietly aching, because part of him feared he could never give his son the same comfort. But Emily never let him stay in that shadow for long. Whenever Daniel leaned on her, she found ways to include Richard. 2. If Daniel told her a story, she would say, "Why don't you tell your dad too?" If Daniel reached for her hand, she gently guided the boy's other hand toward his father. Slowly, Richard began to realize she wasn't replacing him. She was helping him. She was teaching him how to step into his son's world without fear. 1. Evening, Richard invited Emily and Lily to his mansion for dinner. It was the first time they had visited his home, and the difference between their world and his was striking. The marble floors, the endless rooms, the grand staircase, all of it seemed overwhelming compared to their small apartment.
Ow.
Lily clutched Emily's hand tightly as they entered, her eyes wide, while Daniel ran excitedly to show her his toys. At the dinner table, surrounded by chandeliers and polished silverware, Emily looked almost out of place, but her calmness never wavered. She smiled politely, helped the children with their food, and even teased Richard when he awkwardly tried to serve soup. "For someone who runs companies, you're terrible at ladling soup," she joked, making Daniel and Lily giggle. Richard laughed too, a real laugh that surprised even him. He realized then that his house had never felt so alive. All the wealth in the world hadn't filled it with this kind of warmth. After dinner, while the children played in the living room, Richard found himself standing with Emily by the window, looking out at the vast city lights below. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Richard said quietly, "I used to think I had everything. but I see now how much I was missing." Emily looked at him, her eyes soft. "You were missing moments. Money can buy many things, but it can't buy those." Her words struck him deeply. He wanted to say more, to confess that her presence had changed him, but he held back. He was still a man learning how to open his heart, still afraid of moving too fast. Time passed, and their bond grew naturally. The children became inseparable, and through them, the adults grew closer too. Richard began to walk Emily and Lily home after late evenings. Sometimes they shared stories on the way, sometimes they walked in silence, but the silence was never uncomfortable. It was filled with something unspoken, something growing between them. One rainy evening, when they were caught in a sudden downpour, Richard instinctively held his jacket over Emily and Lily to shield them from the rain. They laughed together. As they ran down the street, the children squealing with joy. When they finally reached the building, soaked but smiling, Richard realized he hadn't felt that alive in years. It was in those simple, messy moments that love quietly began to take root. Not the kind of love built on passion or grand gestures, but the steady, honest kind built on respect, trust, and shared struggles. Still, Richard wrestled with doubts. Would Emily ever truly accept a man like him? Could someone who had lived, simply and proudly, ever feel at home in his world of wealth and power? He didn't want to trap her, didn't want to insult her independence, but he also couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her. The answer came one night, not in grand words, but in a small, quiet gesture. Daniel had a nightmare and ran into his father's room. Richard woke to find his son trembling, clutching Rusty. He gathered him into his arms awkwardly, unsure of how to soothe him. Then Daniel whispered, "Can you call Emily? She makes the bad dreams go away." Richard's chest tightened. For a moment, jealousy pricked at him. But then he realized it wasn't jealousy, it was truth. Emily had something he didn't, but instead of pushing her away, he needed to learn from her. That night, instead of calling her, he remembered the way she whispered to Daniel, the way she stroked his hair. He tried it himself awkwardly at first, but to his surprise, Daniel relaxed against him, drifting back to sleep. It was a turning point. Richard realized he didn't have to be perfect. He just had to try. Months later, on a sunny afternoon, Richard invited Emily and Lily again to the mansion, but this time it wasn't just for dinner. He had arranged a small picnic in the garden, far from the grand halls and formal dining rooms. Ate just a blanket on the grass, sandwiches, and lemonade. The children played while the two of them sat side by side. "Do you ever think about the diner night?" Richard asked suddenly. Emily smiled faintly. Every now and then, it was scary, but maybe it happened for a reason. Richard looked at her, his heart pounding. He wanted to tell her everything, that she had changed him, that she had given him back his son, that she had given him something no amount of money ever could. But instead, he simply said, "You've changed my life." Emily turned her head, her eyes meeting his. For a long moment, they held each other's gaze, and words weren't necessary. The silence between them spoke everything. In time, what had begun as an unexpected bond grew into something deeper, something unbreakable. Richard wasn't just a billionaire anymore. He was a father who learned to laugh, to listen, to love. Emily wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the woman who taught him what truly mattered. And together they built a new kind of family, one not defined by wealth or status, but by the strength of love and the joy of small moments. Years later, people would still talk about Richard Dalton, the man who built empires. But those who truly knew him would remember something else. The way he knelt on the grass with his son and Lily, laughing freely, his expensive suit forgotten, his heart finally at peace. And all of it had started in a small diner on an ordinary night when a waitress pulled a frightened boy under a table and showed them both what love really looked like.